Deep in the heart of an African wildlife sanctuary, the golden sun cast long shadows over the dry savanna. The land was quiet, unusually so, as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath. Beneath the shade of an ancient acacia tree lay a lion, a creature that had once ruled this land with strength and majesty. But now his mighty frame was weak, his breathing slow and labored. His once glorious mane, which had shimmered under the African sun, was now dull and ragged. The fire in his eyes had dimmed, and his powerful roar, which had once echoed across the plains, was nothing more than a shallow whisper. Standing beside him was Daniel, the man who had cared for him for years. As a caretaker in the sanctuary, Daniel had always known that this day would come. But knowing something is inevitable doesn't make it any easier. His hands clenched into fists as he watched the lion struggle, his heart heavy with emotions he couldn't quite put into words. To the world, this was just another wild animal, another creature reaching the end of its time. But to Daniel, he was more than that. Their relationship had grown over the years, transforming from a simple caretaker and animal dynamic into something deeper, something unspoken but understood. Daniel had been there when the lion first arrived, injured and alone. He had nursed him back to health, watched him regain his strength, and witnessed him reclaim his rightful place in the sanctuary. He had seen the lion at his strongest, his proudest, and now he was seeing him at his weakest. Daniel took a deep breath, kneeling beside the lion. He placed a gentle hand on the lion's mane, feeling the slow rise and fall of his chest. The lion's amber eyes met his, and in that moment, it was as if an entire lifetime of memories passed between them. There was a sadness in those eyes, but also something else, something Daniel couldn't quite understand. It was almost as if the lion wanted to tell him something, something important. A knot formed in Daniel's throat. He had seen animals pass away before. It was part of the job. But this was different. This was personal. Then, just as the sun began to set, something happened. The lion, despite his weakened state, lifted his head slightly. His gaze sharpened, and for a brief second it was as if the old strength had returned to him. His ears twitched, and his eyes darted towards something in the distance. Daniel followed the lion's gaze, his brow furrowing in confusion. There was nothing there, just the empty plains stretching out endlessly. But the lion saw something, and whatever it was, it meant something. Then with a final labored breath, the lion did something that left Daniel frozen in place, something he would never forget. Long before he lay dying beneath the acacia tree, before his strength faded and his roar became a whisper, the lion was a legend of the wild. His name, given to him by those who had come to know him, was Azu, a name that meant mighty one in an old tribal language. And for most of his life, he had lived up to that name. Azu was born deep in the African savanna, where survival was not guaranteed but earned. His mother, a fierce lioness, raised him alongside his siblings in a hidden den, shielding them from the dangers of the wild. In those early days, life was simple, playing with his siblings, feeding under the watchful eye of his mother, and learning the ways of the pride. But the savanna was an unforgiving land, and only the strongest survived. By the time he was a year old, Azu had already seen the brutal reality of life. One of his siblings was taken by a crocodile near a watering hole, vanishing beneath the water's surface before their mother could react. Another fell ill and never recovered. It was then that Azu learned a harsh but vital lesson. Only the fittest endured. As he grew, his muscles strengthened, his senses sharpened, and his instincts became lethal. He trained alongside the older lions, watching and mimicking their movements, learning how to stalk prey, how to fight, and how to lead. He was not the biggest, nor was he the fastest, but what set him apart was his willpower. Azu did not accept defeat, even in play fights with his siblings. The savanna belonged to those who claimed it, and he was determined to carve his place in it. When Azu reached full maturity, he was a sight to behold, his mane thick and dark, his golden eyes reflecting an untamed fire. He had proven himself in the pride, taking down powerful prey, defending his territory and earning the respect of his kin. But no kingdom in the wild remains uncontested. One fateful evening, as the sun cast an orange glow over the land, another lion emerged at the edge of Azu's territory. A challenger. He was younger, leaner, and just as powerful, with the hunger of an animal that had not yet known defeat. There was no room for hesitation. In the wild, dominance is not given, it is taken. The fight was brutal, a clash of raw power and survival instinct. Dust filled the air as the two lions roared, their claws tearing through flesh, their teeth seeking purchase. Azu fought with everything he had, his muscles burning, his heart pounding, but the challenger was relentless. Zu, mighty as he was not invincible. A deep gash on his side weakened him, and for the first time in his life, he faltered. The challenger seized the moment, pinning Azu to the ground and forcing submission. The battle was over. Azu was no longer king. Exiled from his own pride, wounded and defeated, he wandered the savannah alone. His body bore the marks of battle, and his spirit carried the weight of loss. He tried to hunt but lacked the strength to chase prey. Scavenging became his only means of survival, but even that was not enough. His once glorious mane became matted, his ribs more visible with each passing week. It was during this time when Zu was at his weakest that he crossed paths with humans for the first time. A group of poachers had set up camp near a dried-out riverbed, their rifles ready, their traps laid. They were looking for an easy target, and Azu, weakened and desperate, was exactly that. He didn't see the snare hidden beneath the dust until it tightened around his leg. The pain was immediate, sharp, and unforgiving. He roared, struggling, against the trap, but the more he fought, the deeper it cut into his flesh. His cries of agony carried across the savannah, reaching the ears of someone who had spent years protecting animals like him. Daniel. Daniel had been working in the sanctuary for nearly a decade, rescuing injured and endangered animals from poachers and rehabilitating them. When he heard the lion's distressed roars, he knew something was wrong. Without hesitation, he and his team set out, following the echoes of suffering through the dry landscape. When Daniel first laid eyes on Azu, he saw not just a wounded lion, but a warrior brought down by fate. The lion's golden eyes, though, filled with pain, still held the remnants of pride, of resistance. Even as he lay trapped, bleeding and exhausted, Azu did not surrender easily. Approaching cautiously, Daniel knew he had little time. The poachers would return soon, and if they found the lion before he could be freed, they would not hesitate to kill him. Signaling his team, he moved swiftly, using tranquilizers to sedate the lion just enough to work on his wounds without putting him under too deeply. With careful hands, they loosened the snare, cleaned the injury, and loaded the unconscious lion onto their vehicle. That was the day Azu's life changed forever. He had lost his kingdom, his pride, and his place in the wild. But fate had led him somewhere new, a place where he would not just survive, but form a bond unlike any he had ever known. When Azu first arrived at the sanctuary, he was not the broken, defeated lion that the world might have expected. He was injured, yes. His body bore the scars of his past battles, and his strength had faded, but his spirit had not crumbled. He was still a lion, still proud, still untamed, and that made Daniel's job much harder. For days, Azu refused to eat. He would not touch the meat left for him, no matter how fresh it was. He lay in the corner of his enclosure, watching everything with sharp, untrusting eyes. He did not attack, nor did he lash out, but there was a distance between him and the humans trying to help him. It was as if he was waiting, testing, trying to understand what this new world meant for him. Daniel had worked with many lions before, but Azu was different. There was something in his gaze, a fire, a deep-rooted defiance. It was clear he did not see himself as a rescued animal. He was a king without a kingdom, and he refused to bow to anyone. Understanding that trust could not be forced, Daniel took a slow approach. Instead of rushing into Azu's space, he spent hours sitting near, his enclosure just existing in his presence. He would talk to him in a calm, steady voice, letting the lion get used to his scent, his sound, his presence. It was a game of patience, and Daniel was willing to play it. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. One evening, after another long day of waiting and watching, Daniel sat near the enclosure as usual. Azu, who had been avoiding the food for days, finally moved. Not towards the meal, but towards Daniel. It was subtle, a slight shift, a glance in his direction. It was the first time Azu had acknowledged him not as a stranger, but as something else. Over the weeks, small moments like these built their bond. Azu began eating again, slowly regaining his strength. His movements became more confident, his eyes more alert, and yet he remained cautious, as if part of him still hesitated to trust. The real test came during a stormy night. The sky was filled with roaring thunder, and the rain pounded against the sanctuary like a relentless drum. Most of the animals had retreated to their shelters, but Azu was restless. Daniel, sensing his unease, stayed nearby. That night, a sudden bolt of lightning struck a tree near Azu's enclosure, sending a shock through the ground. The noise was deafening, and for the first time Azu reacted, not with anger but with fear. Instead of retreating into the shadows, he moved toward the fence, closer to Daniel's presence. It was a silent acknowledgement, a moment where, perhaps without realizing it, Azu had chosen to seek comfort in the only person he had learned to recognize as familiar. From that point on, things changed. Azu began to respond when Daniel spoke, his ears twitching at the sound of his voice. He recognized him not just as a caretaker, but as something more. Even when other workers came and went, Azu's gaze would always follow Daniel. One day, Daniel decided to take the bond further. Instead of feeding Azu through the usual methods, he stepped closer than ever before, holding out the meat with his own hands. The other workers watched with held breath, uncertain of how the lion would react. Azu stared at Daniel, unmoving. For a moment, the old warrior within him seemed to surface. His muscles tensed, his golden eyes locked onto Daniel's. Then slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward and took the food. It was not just a meal. It was a message. From that day, Azu's behavior changed. He no longer flinched at Daniel's presence. When Daniel walked past, Azu's ears would perk up. If Daniel spoke, Azu would listen. There was trust now, not complete, but enough to bridge the gap between them. Azu had lost his pride, but in Daniel he had found something new. Not a master, not an owner, but perhaps, in some unspoken way, a friend. At first, the signs were barely noticeable. Azu was still the same proud lion, moving with the quiet authority that had always defined him. He still watched over his enclosure as if it were his kingdom, still responded to Daniel's presence with recognition. But there were small changes, subtle, shifts that only someone who truly knew him would see. The first thing Daniel noticed was Azu's appetite. The lion had always been a strong eater, tearing into his meals with the hunger of a predator that understood survival. But one evening, as Daniel brought his food, Azu barely looked at it. He sniffed the meat, nudged it slightly with his nose, but then turned away. At first, Daniel thought it was just an off day. Animals had those, just like humans. Maybe he wasn't hungry. Maybe he was simply tired. But then it happened again, and again. Within a week, Azu's meals were going unfinished. The lion who had once devoured every piece of meat as if it were his last now picked at his food, or ignored it entirely. Daniel's concern deepened, but he tried not to panic. Could have been anything. Maybe a temporary illness, maybe the changing weather affecting his appetite. Then came the second sign. Azu was sleeping more. Of course, lions spent most of their day resting, but this was different. He wasn't just lounging lazily under the sun as he used to. He was truly exhausted. His movements became slower, his responses delayed. Where he once greeted Daniel with a slow, deliberate lift of his head, he now barely acknowledged his presence. Daniel watched him closely, his heart sinking with each passing day. One evening, he decided to test something. He approached the fence and called Azu's name, the way he always did. Usually, the lion's ears would twitch. His head would turn slightly in acknowledgement. But this time, Azu didn't react. He lay still, his breathing steady but unusually. Though Daniel called again, this time louder. No response, a chill ran down his spine. He took a step closer, gripping the fence. "Azu," he said again, his voice filled with quiet urgency. Finally, the lion stirred. Slowly, his eyes opened, but they lacked their usual sharpness. Instead of the piercing golden gaze Daniel had grown so familiar with, there was something distant. In them, something tired. That was the moment Daniel knew something was truly wrong. Panic threatened to take hold of him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He immediately contacted the sanctuary's veterinarians, his voice strained as he explained the situation. They arrived quickly, carrying their medical equipment, their faces serious as they assessed the lion. They checked his breathing, his pulse, his temperature. They ran their hands along his body, checking for signs of injury or pain. Azu did not resist. He barely moved. That, more than anything, terrified Daniel. "He's weak," one of the vets said. "It could be an infection or something internal. We'll need tests." Daniel nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had seen animals get sick before, had watched many recover and some not. But this was different. This was Azu. This was the lion he had watched over for years, the lion who had trusted him in a way that was rare for a creature of his kind. The thought of losing him was unbearable. That night, Daniel stayed by Azu's enclosure long after the other workers had left. The sky had turned dark, the sounds of the savannah quieting into the stillness of the night. He leaned against the fence, watching the lion he had come to love like a friend. Azu's chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths. He was still there, still holding on. But for how long? Daniel clenched his fists, his heart heavy with a fear he couldn't push away. He had saved Azu once before, had pulled him from the jaws of death when he had been left to die by poachers. But this was something else. This was a battle that neither of them knew how to fight. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt completely helpless. Daniel barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind filled with worst-case scenarios. The sanctuary had seen many animals come and go, but Azu was different. He wasn't just another lion in need of care, he was family. The thought of losing him was unbearable, but Daniel knew he couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. Azu needed him to be strong. The next morning, the veterinary team arrived early, their faces serious. They carried medical equipment and sedatives, ready to begin a full examination. Daniel stood by, watching as they worked, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. They sedated Azu just enough to keep him calm but not fully unconscious. As they moved closer, they checked his vitals, running their hands along his body, searching for any visible signs of illness. One of the vets, Dr. Malik, frowned as he pressed gently against Azu's abdomen. "He's dehydrated," Dr. Malik murmured, "and there's some swelling here. Could be an infection or something internal." Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "Can it be treated?" "We won't know until we run tests," another vet replied. "We need blood samples, x-rays, maybe even an ultrasound. It could be something minor, or it could be something serious." They worked quickly, drawing blood, checking Azu's breathing, monitoring his heart rate. Through it all, Daniel stayed close, watching every movement, listening to every word. Azu barely reacted. That was what scared Daniel the most. The lion who had once fought to survive, who had endured so much, now simply lay still, as if he no longer had the strength to resist. Once the tests were done, they set up an IV to give him fluids, hoping to stabilize him. They injected antibiotics in case of infection, painkillers to ease his discomfort. Then all they could do was wait. Waiting was the hardest part. Daniel sat by Azu's enclosure for hours, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, looking for any sign of improvement. The vets had left, promising to call as soon as they had results, but Daniel couldn't bring himself to leave. He had spent years caring for this lion, understanding him, learning his every habit. And now, as Azu lay weak and unresponsive, Daniel felt utterly helpless. He wanted to believe that Azu would fight, that he would recover like he always had. But as the hours dragged on, doubt crept in. What if this was different? What if this time Azu wouldn't make it? Memories flooded his mind. Of the first time Azu had truly trusted him. Of the stormy night when Azu had moved closer instead of pulling away. Of the moments when they had simply existed in each other's presence. A man and a lion bound by something unspoken. Daniel exhaled shakily, gripping the fence as if it could hold him together. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. "You've been through worse. You can get through this too." But Azu didn't respond. His breathing remained slow, steady, unchanged. The call came the next morning. Dr. Malik's voice was calm but serious. "Daniel, we got the results. It's not an infection. It's worse." Daniel's heart pounded. "What is it?" There was a pause. Then the words Daniel had feared. "It's organ failure." The world seemed to tilt for a moment. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "We don't know what caused it exactly. It could be age. It could be long-term damage from his past injuries. But his liver and kidneys are shutting down. We can try treatments to keep him comfortable, but..." Another pause. "Daniel, there's no cure for this." "No cure." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "You're saying he's dying?" The silence on the other end said everything. He felt his legs weaken, as if the ground beneath him had vanished. He had known something was wrong, but he hadn't expected this. Azu had always been strong, had always survived. The thought of a world without him in it didn't seem real. "What can we do?" His voice was barely a whisper. "We can give him medication to ease the pain. We can try to make him as comfortable as possible. But, Daniel, it's only a matter of time." Time. Daniel looked over at Azu, who lay in the shade of his enclosure, his breathing slow but steady. He had no idea how much time they had left. Days, maybe weeks. But one thing was certain. Daniel would not let Azu face this alone. Tears burned at the back of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not when Azu still needed him. If Azu had fought his whole life, then Daniel would fight for him now. Even if he couldn't save him, he would make sure that his final days were filled with comfort, with love, with the dignity a king deserved. Because Azu was not just any lion. He was his lion. Daniel had always known that one day Azu's time would come. But no amount of preparation could have made him ready for it. After the call from Dr. Malik, the days blurred together. Azu's condition worsened slowly, but steadily. His once powerful body, the same that had once roamed with strength and authority, grew frail. His muscles, once taut with power, began to shrink. The golden glow of his fur dulled, his movement slowed, and his breath became heavier. And yet he was still Azu. Even in his weakness, he tried to lift his head when Daniel approached. His ears still twitched at the sound of Daniel's voice. He still recognized him. That, more than anything, was what kept Daniel from breaking down. The sanctuary team did everything they could to keep Azu comfortable. He was given pain medication, IV fluids, and soft bedding to rest on. They placed him in the most shaded part of his enclosure, away from the harsh sun. But Daniel knew that Azu didn't care about any of that. What mattered most to him wasn't comfort. It was familiarity. And so Daniel never left his side. Every morning he sat by Azu's enclosure, talking to him the way he always had. He told him stories of the other lions, of the birds that circled overhead, of the wind that rustled through the trees. He told him of the first time they had met, of the nights spent watching the stars, of the bond that had formed between them without either of them realizing it. Azu, too weak to respond, would simply listen. His golden eyes, though tired, still held something deep inside them. Understanding, trust, peace. On what Daniel somehow knew would be Azu's final night, the air was different. The world felt quieter. The usual sounds of the sanctuary, distant. Roars, rustling leaves, the chirping of insects. seemed muted, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Azu had barely moved all day. His breathing was slow, his body completely still except for the occasional twitch of his tail. Daniel sat next to him just outside the enclosure, his fingers gripping the fence. "You know," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I never told you this, but you changed my life." Azu didn't move, but Daniel knew he was listening. "I thought I was here to save you," Daniel continued, his throat tightening. "But I think in a way you saved me too." Azu exhaled softly, his body rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. Daniel swallowed hard. He wanted to say more, but the words caught in his throat. And then Azu did something that broke him completely. Slowly, with great effort, the lion lifted his head, just slightly, just enough. His tired eyes met Daniel's, and for a brief moment the lion who had once been a warrior, a survivor, a king, was there again. Then, just as slowly, Azu lowered his head back down. Daniel reached a hand through the fence, his fingers barely brushing against Azu's fur. It was the closest they had ever been, and then, as the night deepened, Azu took one final breath and let go. The world did not stop. The stars still shone, the wind still moved through the trees. But for Daniel, everything else faded. The mighty lion, the friend he had fought for, the soul he had come to love, was gone. Daniel didn't move for a long time. He simply sat there, his fingers still brushing against Azu's fur, his heart heavier than it had ever been. He had known this moment would come. He had told himself he was ready. But nothing could have prepared him for the silence Azu left behind. The morning after Azu's passing was eerily silent. The sanctuary, usually alive with the distant roars of lions and the chatter of birds, felt different. The absence of Azu's presence was a void too heavy to ignore. Daniel hadn't moved from where he sat, his fingers still resting on the cool metal fence of Azu's enclosure. The mighty lion lay still, his golden mane unmoving in the soft morning breeze. His body, once filled with strength and life, was now peaceful in a way that felt almost unreal. The reality of it hit Daniel in waves. Azu was gone, the lion he had saved, the friend he had spent years caring for, the creature who had trusted him, in a way wild animals rarely did. And now, all that was left was silence. Tears welled up in Daniel's eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. He had known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. A few of the sanctuary staff had gathered nearby, watching with quiet sorrow. They had all known Azu in some way, had seen him transform from a broken, wounded creature into a proud, resilient lion. But no one had known him the way Daniel had. No one had understood the bond they shared. Dr. Malik approached slowly, placing a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Take your time," he said softly. "We'll handle everything when you're ready." But Daniel wasn't ready. How could he ever be ready to say goodbye? He took a deep breath, wiping his face as he stood up. His legs felt heavy, his heart even more so. Slowly, he stepped into the enclosure. One last time. Kneeling beside Azu, he ran a hand through his thick mane, the way he had always wished he could while the lion was alive. Azu had never been one for touch, but now there was no resistance. "You were a king, buddy," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "And you always will be." The staff had prepared a resting place for Azu near a shaded tree, one of his favorite spots in the sanctuary. It was a place where he had often lounged, watching the world with quiet authority. It only felt right that this would be his final home. As they carefully moved Azu, Daniel walked beside him the whole way. He couldn't shake the feeling that, even in death, Azu deserved dignity, deserved to be honored. When they finally reached the spot, Daniel hesitated. He looked down at Azu's still form, his heart clenching with a pain he could barely contain. And then, something unexpected happened. From the far end of the sanctuary, a deep, echoing roar rang through the air. Then another, and another. One by one, the lions of the sanctuary, Azu's fellow rescued companions, began to roar. Some were near, some were farther away, but together their voices formed a powerful, haunting chorus. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It was as if they knew, as if they were mourning their own. Tears slipped down his face as he listened. This wasn't just grief, it was a farewell, an acknowledgement of the king that had walked among them. Daniel took a step forward, placing a hand on Azu's mane one last time. "You hear that?" he whispered. "They know who you were." The roars continued, filling the air with a deep, rumbling sadness, and in that moment, Daniel felt something shift. Azu may have been gone, but his legacy would never fade. His story would never be forgotten. As the last roar echoed into the sky, Daniel finally let go, and in the silence that followed, he knew Azu was at peace. The days after Azu's passing were the hardest Daniel had ever faced. The sanctuary felt emptier, quieter, as if even nature itself was mourning. Every morning, Daniel still found himself walking towards Azu's enclosure, expecting to see him lying in the shade, watching him with those deep, knowing eyes. But Azu wasn't there. Only the memories remained. Grief came in waves, some moments bearable, others overwhelming. Daniel had spent years caring for Azu, learning his moods, understanding his unspoken language. Now, without him, there was a hollow space in Daniel's life, one that nothing could fill. The other sanctuary staff gave him space, understanding that Azu had been more than just a lion to him. He was family. Even the other lions seemed different. They had gone quiet in the days following Azu's departure, as if they too felt his absence. But Daniel knew he couldn't let grief consume him. Azu had been a survivor, a fighter, and he deserved to be remembered not just with sorrow, but with honor. So Daniel decided to give him the tribute he truly deserved. With the help of the sanctuary team, he built a memorial near Azu's favorite resting spot, under the large tree where he had spent so many peaceful days. A beautifully carved stone was placed there, with an inscription that read, "Azu, the lion who taught us strength, resilience, and love." Below it, Daniel had added a personal note. "You were more than a lion. You were a legend. You will never be forgotten." The day the memorial was unveiled, people from all around came to pay their respects, staff members, volunteers, even visitors who had once seen Azu during their tours. Some brought flowers, others simply stood in silence, remembering the lion who had touched so many lives. Daniel shared Azu's story on social media, telling the world about the lion who had survived against all odds, who had learned to trust, who had formed an unbreakable bond with a human. The response was overwhelming. People from different countries shared their condolences, their admiration. Messages flooded in, stories of how Azu's journey had inspired them, how his strength had reminded them to keep fighting through their own struggles. Donations poured into the sanctuary in Azu's name, helping rescue more lions in need. Azu's legacy was now saving others, ensuring that his story would not only be remembered, but that it would make a difference. But for Daniel, the most profound impact wasn't in the tributes or the messages. It was in the quiet moments, the memories that stayed with him, the way the wind rustled through the trees where Azu had once slept, the distant roars of other lions carrying on his legacy, the feeling that somehow Azu was still watching over the place he had called home. One evening, as Daniel stood by the memorial, he whispered, "I hope you know how much you were loved." And in that moment, as the wind gently stirred the leaves, he liked to believe that Azu had heard him. A few weeks had passed since Azu's passing, but the ache in Daniel's heart hadn't faded. Every morning he still found himself glancing toward Azu's enclosure, half expecting to see him there. The sanctuary moved forward, as life always does, but for Daniel something felt incomplete, like Azu had left too soon, like there was something unfinished. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. Daniel was making his usual rounds when a junior caretaker called him over to Azu's old enclosure. "You need to see this," she said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. Curious but wary, Daniel followed her. Inside the enclosure, near the tree where Azu had often rested, was something unusual, a patch of disturbed dirt. It was strange because no one had been inside since Azu had passed. Slowly, Daniel crouched down, brushing away the dirt with his fingers. And then he saw it. Buried beneath the earth was an old, worn-out object, Azu's favorite wooden enrichment toy. Azu had never been one for toys, but this particular piece, of wood, shaped like a rough ball, had been the only thing he had ever seemed to care for. Daniel had given it to him years ago when he was still learning to trust, and to everyone's surprise, Azu had kept it close. Over time, he had chewed on it, carried it around, even slept near it on occasion. But months ago, the toy had gone missing. Daniel had searched for it, assuming it had been lost or broken. Yet here it was, buried in the very spot where Azu had spent his final days. A lump formed in Daniel's throat. Had Azu hidden it here himself? Had he known somehow that his time was coming? Daniel lifted the wooden toy in his hands, running his fingers over the deep grooves where Azu's powerful jaws had once held it. It was rough, weathered but still intact, just like Azu had been. The realization hit him like a wave. Azu had left something behind, a piece of himself, a silent message, a final connection. Daniel closed his eyes, holding the toy tightly as a tear slipped down his cheek. It was as if Azu was still there, reminding him that their bond would never fade, that he wasn't truly gone. That night, Daniel placed the wooden toy at the base of Azu's memorial, right beside the inscription that honored him. It was a quiet tribute, one that only he and Azu would understand. And as he stood there under the vast, starry sky, he finally felt a sense of peace. Azu was gone, but his presence, his spirit, would always remain. And that was something death could never take away. Azu's story wasn't just about a lion and his caretaker. It was about something much deeper. Trust, resilience, and the unspoken bond that can exist between two souls, even when they come from completely different worlds. Daniel had once thought that he was saving Azu, that he was giving him a second chance at life. But in the end, Azu had given Daniel something just as precious, a purpose, a friendship that transcended words, and a reminder that love isn't confined to species or language. It exists in gestures, in moments of quiet understanding, in the willingness to stand by someone, even when the road is difficult. Azu had suffered, fought, and survived. But more than that, he had learned to trust. And for a wild creature like him, that was perhaps the greatest gift of all. In the days following his passing, Daniel often found himself reflecting on everything Azu had taught him. He had always believed that lions were symbols of strength, of power. But Azu had shown him another kind of strength, the ability to be vulnerable, to form bonds, to trust even after experiencing pain. And wasn't that the same for all of us? How often do we build walls around ourselves, afraid to let others in? How many of us carry past wounds, believing that we must always fight alone? Azu's journey was a testament to the fact that healing is possible, not just for animals, but for humans too. The sanctuary continued to grow, rescuing more lions, giving them a second chance at life, just as Azu had once been given. But no matter how many new lions arrived, Azu's presence remained. His story had touched not just Daniel, but thousands of people who had followed his journey. His memorial became a place where visitors would stop, read his inscription, and reflect on what it meant to truly love and care for another being. One day, a young boy visiting the sanctuary stood by Azu's memorial for a long time, staring at the wooden toy Daniel had placed there. When Daniel walked past, the boy turned and asked, "Did he love you?" The question caught Daniel off guard. Love. Did lions love? He thought of Azu's final days, the way he had still tried to acknowledge him despite his weakness, the way he had lifted his head one last time, as if to say goodbye. Daniel smiled, kneeling beside the boy. I think, in his own way, he did. And perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. Love isn't always spoken. It isn't always shown in grand gestures. Sometimes it's in the quiet moments, in the trust built over time, in the willingness to stay by someone's side, even when there's nothing left to say. Azu may have been just one lion, but his story was a reminder that every creature, no matter how wild, has the capacity for connection. And that, in the end, is what truly matters. Because love, in all its forms, is what makes life worth living.